She stood there in the rain, one hand protecting her swollen belly, the other clutching a plastic bag with everything she owned in this world. 24 years old, pregnant, homeless, cast out like trash by people who never saw her as human. Just 7 months ago, she was folding their laundry, scrubbing their floors, cooking their meals. Now she was nothing to them. Less than nothing. And the cruelest part? She hadn't done anything wrong. Not really. She dropped a plate. One plate. But that wasn't why they threw her out. It was never about the plate. It was about what she represented. A problem. An inconvenience. A reminder that poor people have bodies that break and hearts that feel and lives that matter. They couldn't have that in their pristine home. So they made her disappear. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happens when the world decides you're disposable? When every door slams shut and every face turns away. When you're carrying life inside you but death seems to be circling closer. Elena Washington didn't know the answer to those questions when she stepped out into that cold November night in Charlotte, North Carolina. She didn't know that sometimes the darkest moments are just before the dawn. That sometimes when humans fail us, something greater steps in. That sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones searching desperately for what she had all along. She didn't know that the man who would stop his car on that lonely road wasn't there by accident. That his heart had been prepared for that exact moment. That her suffering, as unbearable as it felt, was about to collide with purpose in a way that would change multiple lives forever. All she knew was that her feet hurt, her back ached, and her baby was kicking hard against her ribs as if to say, "Keep going, mama, keep going." Elena's mother used to say that God doesn't make mistakes with people. That every soul born into this world has a purpose, even if that purpose takes years to reveal itself. Her mother, Diane, had been a seamstress in a small shop on the west side of Charlotte, her fingers magic with needle and thread, transforming torn fabric into something beautiful again. She'd sing hymns while she worked, old gospel songs that filled their tiny apartment with something bigger than the poverty they lived in. Songs about valleys and mountains, about weeping that lasts for a night but joy that comes in the morning. Elena grew up watching her mother find dignity in humble work. Diane never complained about the early mornings or the late nights, never spoke bitterly about the wealthy clients who barely acknowledged her existence. She taught Elena that character isn't built in comfort but in how you carry yourself when life gets hard. When you treat people with respect even when they don't deserve it. When you keep your head up even when the world is trying to push it down. Those lessons sank deep into Elena's spirit, became the foundation of who she was. But life has a way of testing the lessons we learn. When Elena was 18, cancer came for her mother with a viciousness that still haunted her 6 years later. It started as fatigue, then pain, then a diagnosis that felt like a death sentence. Stage 4. They gave her months. Elena dropped out of community college to care for her, spending her days in a hospital that smelled like disinfectant and despair, holding her mother's hand while the chemo ravaged her body. Diane's hair fell out in clumps. Her skin turned gray. Her beautiful voice, once so strong in those hymns, became a whisper. But even dying she was teaching. One night, maybe 2 weeks before the end, Diane squeezed Elena's hand and said something Elena would never forget. She said, "Baby girl, life is going to hurt you in ways I can't protect you from. Men are going to disappoint you. The world is going to treat you like you don't matter. But you listen to me. Your worth doesn't come from what people think of you. It comes from whose you are, and that means you have value that nobody can take away. Not ever." Diane died on a Tuesday morning in March, the sun streaming through the hospital window like heaven was calling her home. Elena was alone after that. No siblings. No father, he'd left when she was 3. No extended family that cared enough to check on her. She was 19 and utterly isolated in a world that doesn't have much patience for poor black girls with no connections and no safety net. She had to learn fast how to survive. The jobs came in fragments. Cleaning offices at night. Washing dishes at a diner. Stocking shelves at a grocery store. The work was hard and the pay was barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment in a rough neighborhood where gunshots punctuated the night and sirens were the soundtrack of existence. But Elena kept going. She was good at enduring. Her mother had trained her for that. What she wasn't trained for was heartbreak of a different kind. His name was Andre. He worked at the auto shop near her apartment, and he had a smile that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do life alone. He was charming in that easy way some men have, full of promises and compliments, making her feel seen after so many years of being invisible. She fell hard. He said he loved her. Said he wanted to build something with her. Said she was special. And Elena, who'd been starving for love since her mother died, believed every word. When she found out she was pregnant, she cried for an hour before telling him. Not because she didn't want the baby, but because she was terrified of his reaction. She shouldn't have been surprised when he disappeared. Blocked her number. Changed his shifts. Moved out of his apartment without leaving a forwarding address. Gone like smoke. Like he'd never existed. Like their relationship had been a figment of her imagination. She was 23, pregnant and alone again. That's when she took the job with the Reynolds family. Clarissa Reynolds had interviewed her in a living room that cost more than Elena would earn in 10 years, looking her up and down like she was inspecting livestock. The job was live-in maid. Room and board plus $400 a week. It wasn't much, but it was stable, and stability was something Elena desperately needed. She didn't know then that Clarissa Reynolds was a woman who'd confused wealth with worth, who treated her staff like property, who found pleasure in small cruelties disguised as standards. The first few months were manageable. Elena cleaned, cooked, did laundry, ran errands. She stayed invisible, which was the safest way to survive in that house. But as her pregnancy progressed, as her belly grew and her movements slowed, Clarissa's patience thinned. There were comments. Snide remarks about Elena's appearance. Questions about whether she could still perform her duties. Suggestions that maybe she should consider other arrangements. Elena endured it all because she had nowhere else to go. Then came that night. November 3rd. A dinner party with 20 guests, expensive wine flowing, laughter echoing through marble hallways. Elena was in the kitchen washing the good china, the pieces that cost more than a car, her hands shaking from exhaustion. She'd been on her feet for hours. Her back was screaming. The baby was pressing on her bladder so hard she could barely stand. She reached for a plate, the delicate porcelain slipping through her swollen fingers, and watched in horror as it shattered against the tile floor. The sound cut through the dinner party chatter like a gunshot. Clarissa appeared in the doorway, her face twisted with rage that seemed disproportionate to a broken plate. But it wasn't about the plate. It had never been about the plate. It was about Clarissa's need for perfection, her inability to tolerate anything that disrupted her carefully constructed world. And a pregnant maid with shaking hands was a disruption she could eliminate. She didn't yell. That would have been beneath her. Instead, she spoke in that cold, clipped tone that wealthy people use when they want you to know you're less than human. She told Elena to pack her things. That she was careless. That she'd been given chances and wasted them. That the Reynolds family couldn't afford to keep someone so unreliable. Elena tried to explain, tried to apologize, but Clarissa held up one perfectly manicured hand and said the words that would haunt Elena for weeks. Not in my house. Get out. No. Elena packed her life into one garbage bag in less than 20 minutes. Clothes, toiletries, a photo of her mother, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins. That was it. 6 years of being an adult condensed into one bag light enough to carry. Clarissa stood in the doorway watching, arms crossed, making sure Elena didn't steal anything. As if Elena was a thief. As if surviving while poor was a crime worthy of surveillance. When Elena walked out that front door into the cold November night, Clarissa closed it behind her with a finality that echoed in Elena's chest. The rain started almost immediately, as if the sky was mourning what the humans had done. Elena walked because she had no other option. No car. No money for a bus. No friend to call because she'd been working so much she hadn't built any friendships. Just her garbage bag, and a baby 7 months along who kept kicking like a fighter. She walked down the long driveway of the Reynolds estate, past the iron gates, onto the main road that led back toward the city. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights cutting through the darkness, but nobody stopped. Nobody cared. Her feet ached in shoes that no longer fit properly because pregnancy had swollen everything. Her shoulders burned from the weight of the bag. Her lower back felt like it was being stabbed repeatedly with hot knives. But she kept walking because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant dying, and she refused to let her baby die because the world was cruel. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Keep going, baby girl. Just keep going. She couldn't do this. She couldn't keep walking. She had nowhere to go and no strength left to get there. That's when the car stopped. A black sedan, expensive, pulling onto the shoulder about 20 feet ahead of her. Elena's first instinct was fear because women learn early that strange men stopping on dark roads rarely means anything good. She straightened up, ready to run despite her exhaustion. But then the driver's door opened and a young man stepped out, and something about his body language, the way he held his hands visible and moved slowly, made her pause. He was maybe 28, tall with warm brown skin, wearing jeans and a sweater like he'd been somewhere casual. His face held concern, not aggression. He didn't approach her, just stood by his car, giving her space. His voice when he spoke was gentle, like he was trying not to startle a wounded animal. He said, "Miss, are you okay? Do you need help?" And Elena, who'd been holding it together through sheer willpower, felt something crack inside her chest. She tried to say she was fine. That's what you're supposed to say. That's how you protect yourself from pity and judgment. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears started falling, mixing with the rain on her face, and she shook her head because fine was a lie and she was too tired to lie anymore. The man took a step closer, concern deepening in his eyes. He introduced himself. Said his name was Christopher Hartford. Asked if she needed a ride somewhere. Asked if she had somewhere to go. Elena looked at this stranger, this man whose clothes probably cost more than she'd earned in 6 months, and knew she had two choices. She could refuse his help, cling to her pride, and potentially collapse on this road in the rain. Or she could trust that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the world was cruel. Her mother used to say that sometimes the miracle isn't supernatural, it's just a human being choosing kindness when they could choose indifference. She said yes. Said she needed help. Said she had nowhere to go. Watched his face carefully for any sign of judgment or disgust or calculation. But all she saw was compassion. He picked up her bag without being asked, put them in his trunk, opened the passenger door for her. Drove her not to some shelter or emergency room but to a hospital, a good one, where he walked her inside and stayed while they checked her blood pressure and her baby's heartbeat and declared that she was exhausted but stable. The doctor, an older black woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked at Christopher and then at Elena, clearly trying to figure out their relationship. When Elena explained she was homeless, had just been fired, had nowhere to go, the doctor's face softened with a sadness that came from seeing this story too many times. She told Elena she needed rest, proper food, a safe place to sleep. Said the stress she was under could trigger premature labor. Said her baby needed her to take care of herself. Christopher listened to all of this. Didn't interrupt. Didn't make excuses to leave. When the doctor finished, he turned to Elena and said something that seemed impossible. He said he had a guest house on his family's property. That it was empty. That she could stay there until she got back on her feet. No strings attached. No payment required. Just a safe place to heal. Elena stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language because people like him didn't help people like her. That wasn't how the world worked. But he was serious. Completely serious. He gave her his mother's phone number to call if she wanted to verify he was legitimate, told her she could think about it, that he understood if she didn't trust him. But Elena, who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love her, who'd been cast out by people she'd served faithfully, felt something stir in her spirit. That still small voice her mother used to talk about. Said trust him. If you're still watching, comment below and let us know. We want to hear from you. And tell us, what would you have done in Elena's position? Would you have trusted a stranger? The Hartford estate sat on 15 acres in the hills outside Charlotte, the kind of property that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The main house was beautiful, designed with an elegance that spoke of old money rather than new. The guest house sat about 100 yards from the main residence, nestled among oak trees, a small cottage with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and windows that let in golden afternoon light. Christopher showed her around that first night, pointing out where everything was, making sure she knew how to work the heating system, stocking the refrigerator with groceries before he left. Elena stood in the middle of that guest house after he drove away and cried for the second time that day. But these tears were different. Not despair. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. She ran her hands along the clean countertops, tested the soft bed, stood in the shower and let hot water wash away days of accumulated worries and fear. She ate a sandwich made with fresh bread and real meat. She slept for 12 hours straight, her body finally releasing the tension it had held for months. When she woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through the curtains, she half expected to discover it had all been a dream, that she was still on that road in the rain. But it was real. The cottage was real. The safety was real. And when she walked to the window and looked out at the trees turning gold with autumn, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The kind that doesn't come from circumstances but from somewhere deeper. The kind her mother used to pray for. Christopher came by that afternoon with his mother, Margaret Hartford. Elena had been nervous about meeting her, expecting judgment or suspicion. Margaret was in her late 50s, elegant in the way that comes from a lifetime of privilege, but her eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing. She looked at Elena for a long moment, taking in her swollen belly, her worn clothes, the fear barely hidden beneath a mask of dignity. Then she smiled and she said something Elena would never forget. She said, "My son tells me you've had a difficult time. That you need a place to rest. This is your home now for as long as you need it. We won't intrude on your privacy, but if you need anything at all, please let us know. We're glad you're here." The simplicity of it, the lack of conditions or questions or demands for her story, nearly broke Elena. She managed to thank them, her voice shaking, and watched them leave before collapsing on the couch and crying again. The first week was an adjustment. Elena kept waiting for the catch, for the moment when they'd reveal what they wanted from her. Because in her experience, nobody gave without expecting something in return. Men who helped women always wanted something. Rich people who helped poor people always wanted to feel superior. But days passed and the catch never came. Christopher checked on her once a day, bringing groceries or asking if she needed anything, but never lingering, never making her uncomfortable. Margaret invited her to the main house for dinner twice, conversations that were genuine and warm, treating Elena like a guest rather than a charity case. Elena started to heal in that space. Physically first, her body recovering from months of malnutrition and stress. The baby settled down, the kicks becoming less frantic, as if even in the womb her daughter could sense the change. Elena cooked real meals, took walks around the property, read books from the Hartford's extensive library. She found a Bible in the guesthouse bookshelf and started reading it in the mornings, reconnecting with the faith her mother had instilled in her. Started praying again, not the desperate prayers of someone drowning but the grateful prayers of someone being pulled to shore. But as she healed, questions grew. Why were they doing this? Christopher Hartford came from wealth that Elena couldn't even fathom. His father had built a commercial real estate empire. His mother sat on the boards of 3 major charities. They moved in circles where a maid's pregnancy would be nothing more than gossip. Yet they'd opened their home to her, asked for nothing, treated her with a dignity she'd never experienced from wealthy people. It didn't make sense. Christopher himself seemed to be wrestling with something. Elena noticed it in their brief interactions, the way he'd look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not attraction, she was sure of that. Something else. Searching maybe. Or recognition. He asked her about her life sometimes, gentle questions that never felt invasive. About her mother. About her faith. About how she was feeling. And she found herself answering honestly, something she rarely did with anyone. One afternoon in late November, they sat on the guesthouse porch while leaves fell around them, and Christopher told her something that made pieces fall into place. He said he'd been driving that night, the night he found her, because he couldn't sleep. That he'd been struggling with his own questions about purpose and meaning. That his life looked perfect from the outside but felt empty inside. That he'd been praying, actually praying for the first time in years, asking God to show him why he was here, what he was supposed to be doing with his wealth and privilege. And then he'd seen her on that road. Pregnant. Alone. Struggling under the weight of the garbage bag. And something in his chest had cracked open. He said he knew, the way you sometimes just know things, that stopping wasn't random. That meeting her wasn't coincidence. That maybe his purpose wasn't in boardrooms and business deals but in moments like this. In seeing people who'd become invisible to everyone else. In using his resources not to build bigger buildings but to help one desperate woman and her unborn child survive. Elena listened to him, watched tears gather in his eyes, and understood that rescue goes both directions. That she wasn't the only one being saved in this equation. That sometimes when you think you're receiving charity, you're actually giving a gift you didn't know you had. The gift of purpose. Of meaning. Of proving that the world isn't as cold as it sometimes seems. She reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of solidarity between 2 broken people being made whole by something bigger than either of them. But not everyone saw it that way. Word had gotten out somehow, the way news always does in Charlotte's wealthy circles. A friend of a friend who'd seen Christopher's car at the estate with an unfamiliar pregnant woman. Whispers at country clubs and charity galas. Questions about who she was and what she was doing there. The Hartford family had never courted scandal, had built their reputation on dignity and discretion, and suddenly there were rumors swirling that made Margaret's phone ring with concerned calls from friends. The ugliest rumors came from Clarissa Reynolds. She'd heard that Elena was staying with the Hartfords, and rather than feeling shame for what she'd done, she felt vindicated. She started spreading a story, told at cocktail parties and luncheons, about how she'd had to fire a manipulative maid who'd gotten pregnant deliberately to trap some man. How the girl was probably running a scam now, targeting wealthy families, playing the victim to extract money. The story gained traction because people wanted to believe it. Because it was easier to believe a poor black woman was a con artist than to believe she was simply a human being who'd been treated cruelly. Margaret heard the rumors but didn't confront Elena with them. Instead she watched. Observed how Elena carried herself. Saw the way she kept the guest house immaculate without being asked. Noticed how she never requested anything beyond necessities. Watched how she'd sit on the porch reading that worn Bible, her lips moving in silent prayer. Margaret Hartford had been wealthy long enough to know the difference between someone working an angle and someone simply trying to survive with dignity intact. And Elena was the latter. But the rumors created pressure that couldn't be ignored. Christopher's father, William Hartford, who'd been traveling for business during Elena's first month at the estate, came home in early December and demanded a family meeting. William was a good man but a practical one, and he worried about optics and liability and the possibility that they were being deceived. He didn't want to throw Elena out, but he wanted answers. Wanted to understand what his son was thinking. Wanted to know if they were putting their family's reputation at risk for someone who might not deserve it. The conversation happened in William's study, mahogany and leather and the smell of expensive cigars. Christopher defended Elena passionately, explaining how he'd found her, what she'd been through, why he felt compelled to help. Margaret spoke quietly about her observations, about Elena's character as she'd witnessed it. But William remained skeptical, not out of cruelty but out of caution learned from years of people trying to exploit his wealth. He said they needed to verify Elena's story. Needed to talk to her directly. Needed to make sure they weren't being played. Elena agreed to meet with them. Sat in that same study 3 days later, her belly huge now at 8 months, and told them everything. About her mother. About Onye. About Clarissa Reynolds and the broken plate and being thrown out in the rain. She didn't embellish or perform or try to manipulate their emotions. Just told the truth in a voice that shook but didn't break. And when she finished, when she met William Hartford's skeptical gaze with her own steady one, she said something that shifted the entire dynamic. She said, "I understand if you don't believe me. I understand if you need me to leave. But I want you to know that even if I have to go, these weeks here have saved my life. Your son didn't just give me shelter. He gave me hope. He showed me that there are still good people in this world. And whatever happens next, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be that for someone else. Trying to be the person who stops when everyone else drives past. Because that's what concern looks like. And I'm grateful to have witnessed it, even if it has to end now." The silence that followed Elena's words was heavy with things unsaid. William Hartford looked at this young woman, barely more than a girl really, 8 months pregnant and utterly alone in the world, and saw something that made his businessman's skepticism falter. Dignity. The kind that can't be faked. The kind that comes from suffering that either destroys you or forges you into something stronger. He glanced at his wife, saw the tears in Margaret's eyes, looked at his son's face and recognized the expression there. Not romantic love but something almost more powerful. The look of someone who'd found their purpose. William nodded slowly and said Elena could stay. That they'd support her through the birth and help her get established afterward. That they'd been blessed with wealth and it meant nothing if they couldn't use it to help someone who truly needed it. Elena thanked them, excused herself and walked back to the guest house feeling like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. She should have known better. Life doesn't surrender its cruelty so easily. 2 days before Christmas, Clarissa Reynolds showed up at the Hartford estate unannounced. She'd been invited to Margaret's annual holiday party, an event that drew Charlotte's elite, and she arrived early with a purpose. She found Margaret in the main house overseeing preparations and launched into her version of events. Painted Elena as a manipulator who'd been fired for stealing, not breaking a plate. Said the pregnancy was a trap she'd set for multiple men. Claimed she had proof that Elena was running a scam, targeting wealthy families through domestic work positions. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face an unreadable mask that comes from years of navigating high society politics. When Clarissa finished her performance, expecting alliance or at least concern, Margaret said something that cut through the lies like a knife. She said, "Clarissa, I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you treat people as disposable when they're no longer useful to you. I've seen how you speak to waiters and valets and anyone you consider beneath you. So forgive me if I don't take your character assessment of a young woman you threw out while pregnant as particularly credible." Clarissa's face flushed red. She tried to recover, insisted she was just trying to warn a friend, but Margaret wasn't finished. She said she'd done her own investigating. Had called the hospital where Elena had been treated that first night. Had spoken to Elena's former landlord, a woman who said Elena had been a model tenant. Had even tracked down the diner where Elena had worked, where the owner said she'd been reliable and kind and he'd have hired her back in a heartbeat if she'd asked. Every piece of evidence pointed to exactly what Elena had claimed. A good person dealt a bad hand. But Clarissa had come prepared with what she thought was a trump card. She pulled out her phone, showed Margaret a photo she'd gotten from her nephew, a young man named Andre who worked at an auto shop. said that this was the father of Elena's baby, that he was her nephew, that Elena had deliberately gotten pregnant by him to connect herself to the Reynolds family, that this proved manipulation, that Margaret needed to see Elena for what she really was. Margaret looked at that photo for a long time, looked at Clarissa, and then she said something that made Clarissa's face go white. She said, "You're telling me your nephew got a woman pregnant and then abandoned her? And you think this reflects poorly on her? You don't see how this makes your family look like exactly the kind of people who use the vulnerable and discard them? You don't recognize that your nephew's actions are what created the situation?" The thing was, Margaret knew Andre. He'd been at the Reynolds house multiple times for family gatherings. A charming boy with a gift for saying what people wanted to hear. Margaret had never particularly liked him, had always sensed something slippery beneath the charm. And now here was evidence that her instincts had been correct. That he'd gotten a woman pregnant, lied to her, and disappeared. And rather than feeling shame, his aunt was trying to blame the woman he'd victimized. Clarissa tried to spin it, said Elena must have trapped him, but Margaret held up a hand. She said she'd had enough and canceled Clarissa's invitation to the holiday party. That she didn't want people in her home who treated others as less than human. That Elena was under the Hartford family's protection now, and anyone who tried to harm her would be dealing with Margaret directly. It was a declaration of war in the genteel language of high society, and Clarissa knew she'd lost. On January 15th at 3 in the morning, Elena's water broke. She called Christopher in a panic, and he was at the guest house in less than 5 minutes, calm and steady in the way she'd come to depend on. He drove her to the hospital while she breathed through contractions, his hand reaching over occasionally to squeeze hers, reminding her she wasn't alone. Margaret met them there, having been on standby for weeks, ready to support Elena through this journey. Labor was long and hard, 18 hours of pain that made Elena understand why they called it labor. But every time she wanted to give up, wanted to scream that she couldn't do this, she thought about her mother. About all the women who'd done this before her with far less support. About the daughter she was about to meet, the little girl who would be born into love even if her father wanted nothing to do with her. And Elena found strength she didn't know she possessed. The baby girl came into the world at 9:23 that evening, crying with a fierceness that made the nurses laugh. Elena held her daughter for the first time and felt her entire world reorganize itself around this tiny human. Nothing else mattered. Not Andre's rejection. Not Clarissa's cruelty. Not the months of suffering. Only this moment, this child. This overwhelming love that felt like it might crack her chest open. She named her Grace. Grace Diane Washington. Grace for what she'd been given when she deserved judgment. Diane for the mother who taught her how to survive with dignity. The years that followed were beautiful in the way real life is beautiful, not perfect but rich with meaning. Grace grew up knowing her story, knowing that her biological father had made a choice. She grew up confident and loved and determined to pay forward the grace she'd been shown. And when she was 7 years old, standing in the kitchen helping Elena bake cookies, she asked a question that showed she understood more than anyone realized. She said, "Mama, why did God let bad things happen to you if he loved you?" Elena knelt down to her daughter's eye level and said something she'd learned through fire. She said, "Baby girl, God didn't make those bad things happen. People did. People made selfish choices that hurt me. But God took those bad things and used them to bring good. If I hadn't been fired, I wouldn't have been on that road. If I hadn't been on that road. God doesn't cause pain, but he never wastes it either. He transforms it. And that's what faith is, baby. Believing that even in the darkness, he's working something beautiful. So let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were Elena? Would you have gotten in Christopher's car that night? Would you have trusted a stranger? Would you have had the courage to keep going when everything said give up? And what about Christopher? Would you have stopped? Would you have brought her into your home? Would you have risked your reputation and your comfort for someone you didn't know? If this story moved you, hit that like button. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how this made you feel. And if you believe in stories that remind us there's still good in this world, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we share next. Because we're going to keep telling these stories. Stories of pain transformed into purpose. Of ordinary people who chose extraordinary kindness when they could have chosen indifference. Elena believed. And look what happened. Now it's your turn. What will you choose?